Thank you to everyone for coming, because I can see our attendance is just rising there. So thanks very much, folks, for attending. I'm Kate Molloy. If I haven't met you before, I'm a learning technologist at NUI Galway on the west coast of Ireland. I'm also a member of the Enhancing Digital Teaching and Learning project team. Hence, we are having these weekly and fortnightly webinars with the project, but we're taking a tiny bit of a break today to do a DPL themed webinar. So I just might share my screen for a couple of seconds to take care of some housekeeping and to introduce our panelists. So just bear with me. Two seconds. Okay, folks, this webinar came, we've been having the series throughout the spring, throughout the summer, and just given the fact that I'm fortunate enough now that Digital Pedagogy Lab is online, that I was able to attend now for the third year. So I had pitched this idea to our project manager of doing a bit of a crossover and bringing the Digital Pedagogy Lab community in with our Enhancing Digital Teaching and Learning community. So I looked at who was attending and tried to think respectfully of people's time zones in terms of actually coming in on a call like this. And I wanted to have just a very casual conversation around international perspectives on teaching online, because I think we've been very focused to whatever extent, especially in the EDTL team, in looking at our own context. And I thought it would be nice to take some time to take some pause and reflect and think about what's happening just around the world. So because there's a lot going on with Digital Pedagogy Lab, there's a lot going on in terms of our day jobs and a lot of meetings. So if you don't get your question answered or you want to continue the conversation with our panelists, what I would suggest people do is there are two hashtags on Twitter. There's the one IUA DigEd that we use for our project activities, and there's also DigPed, which Digital Pedagogy Lab uses. So if you wanted to combine those or follow the conversations around the project or the event, please do so. And to our guests, I'm really, really humbled and grateful for their time. That I know it's very hard, just given our schedules, to dedicate an hour and a half to coming along to an event like this. But I'm really pleased today to welcome Maha Bali. She's an associate professor of practice at the American University in Cairo. She's the founder of Virtually Connecting.
Co-founder.
She's participating, co-founder, sorry. And she's participating in DPL this year, but she has been an organizer of the event internationally. She's been a track leader and a variety of other associations. We also have Jesse Stommel, the co-founder and associate director of Digital Pedagogy Lab. And Jesse actually delivered his keynote yesterday afternoon, our time. So his blog post around the keynote, I know, is at least out there. And Sukaina Walji, we welcome from Cape Town, that she is the acting deputy director for online education at the University of Cape Town. And she is a Digital Pedagogy Lab 2020 fellow. So just before I hand over to Maha, I was doing a bit of thinking about why I wanted to do this crossover and what I hoped that the Digital Pedagogy Lab experience might bring to the EDTL community or to the Irish community. And one of the things is that if you haven't been to DPL in the face-to-face setting, it's an immersive experience. It's an entire full week of talking, reflecting, taking pause, co-creating and collaborating and really immersing yourself in critical and reflective pedagogy. And our project team have been working very hard, launching the EDTL approach and trying to offer really practical advice to staff around the country, just in terms of getting started with remote teaching and trying to teach remotely in an effective way. But the spirit of DPL is a little bit more chaotic in a very good way. And I wanted to just take pause from our series of webinars and bring it back to a conversation, the kind of conversation that might happen at Digital Pedagogy Lab. So I was having a bit of a think around what kind of question would I use to start the event, that what would I hinge everything upon? And I was reminded of a blog post, just a quick line from Shaw Michael Morris. And I hope it's in the spirit of this conversation, but Sean had written about educational gatherings, and in this quote, he says that educational gatherings today must not be afraid of cacophony. They must not shrink at new knowledge. If they do, they very well may crumble. And that line around cacophony stuck with me, that, you know, our educational gatherings, I think a lot of us have been sitting in front of a screen and sitting a little passively and taking a lot of things in, but I wanted to have a bit more of an active discussion and really think about the world around us and think about all of your individual contexts and what we can learn and what we can take away and what we can build on from that. So I'm hoping for a bit of cacophony, and I'm going to hand over to Maha to share her context before we get to Sukaina and Jessie. So I'm just going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Kate. I love that quote. I'm going to try to keep my intro really, really short so that we have a lot of time for questions and discussion. And so before I start, I just want to ask you a question that's not where are you from, but how are you feeling today? If you guys could just say in the chat how you're feeling today. I learned this from Karen Costa, and I feel like in this pandemic, it's really, I can't get into a conversation without asking people how they're feeling today, because we're all feeling different things, you know. Some people are calling it like the Corona coaster. Sometimes in the same day, you have your ups and downs, and I'm getting a lot of busy. I always feel like busy is not a feeling. I think busy is a state. Optimistic, overwhelmed. I hear overwhelmed, grateful. I love it when people have time to be grateful as well. Not enough sleep, me too. Grateful, feeling good, blessed, nervous, exhausted. That. Yeah, I feel that way most of the time now. Fascinated. Mushroom foraging. Busy, meaning overwhelmed. Yeah, I guess when people say busy, they need brain feels like scrambled eggs. Yeah, exhausted but hopeful. Okay. Ricky, I think you're with us in DitchPed, and I saw you on a discussion forum, and there's only one other Ricky I know in the world, and I thought you must be her, but I just realized it's a name that other people can have, and you're a different person. Okay. So just to give you an idea about my context, because when we talk about international, it's also really important to recognize that no one country is homogeneous, right? So I'm at the American University in Cairo. Both Sukaina and Jessie have visited me here. This is a private, nonprofit, liberal arts institution, so a very American-style education system. Most of the students are privileged, but we do have quite a few scholarship students. And our professors are American, Egyptian, and international. So, but it is an American system. So this does not represent all of Egypt, and all of the kinds of digital disparities. They exist within our institution, but they're much greater outside of our institution for sure. And so pre-pandemic, my role was as a faculty developer, supporting other faculty with their teaching, whether that's workshops, consultations, assessments. And I have the expertise, of course, in digital pedagogy and digital literacies, which is what I teach. That's the course I teach, digital literacies in an intercultural context. And I also have a really important part of my life is my public scholarship, which used to be online. And it was the only part of my life that was fully online, which was virtually connecting and equity unbound. But then, of course, I'm also this overwhelmed multitasking mom who, after the pandemic, you'll see what I look like. But in the past, and again, Jessie and Sukaina will know this, and Kate, of course, and anyone else who knows me, my teaching and public scholarship persona were highly focused on this critical pedagogy and social justice. But in my faculty development role, I was often told to appear less radical, to be less explicit about this perspective that I've had. So I would find ways to put it in, but not as much. But in the pandemic, as a faculty developer, I was responsible for writing documents and setting strategy. I was doing webinars, doing one-on-one support, and I learned some new things like the liberating structures, which I had known before. You should check these out if you've never seen them before, liberatingstructures.com. These are ways of holding equitable conversations with large groups, and they transfer really well online if you have like Zoom breakout rooms and things like that. And then the other thing that I was able to do was the concept of local professional development. So global and local professional development together. Since everybody's online anyway, nobody's having their professional development face to face. So it was an opportunity for me to meld my public scholarship with my internal faculty development work. And I was, I'll jump to my public scholarship because here I started this continuity with care conversation because as soon as this pandemic happened, it felt like we need to focus on care rather than this continuity in the more neoliberal sense that I think administrators might have been talking about. And we sort of crowdsourced, on Equity Unbound, crowdsourced different things people were saying. So stuff that Jesse was doing, I learned a lot from what University of Cape Town were doing, and put that all together. And we had conversations, and we have our own like Twitter DM that keeps us going and does the self-care and community type of work for us. And I've been giving a lot of talks and workshops. And then in my own teaching, I felt like I needed to center students' socio-emotional needs and to center equity. And this also became what I was doing. I felt like I had to focus on what kids in this moment. And one of the things they really needed for their socio-emotional needs was a third place, like Slack, which is not class and not home, but a place to socialize and to talk informally with me and with their colleagues. So I felt like this became a really important thing that was not a synchronous Zoom session, and it wasn't an email, and it wasn't a discussion forum, it's somewhere in between. So I was finally, I think, able to center social justice in my main work. I think this was the time where, if there was ever a time to do this, I think this was the time to do it. And I discovered that people like my boss had been listening. And so by the time it was time to do it, she was ready for this kind of discourse and to let me sort of help us all think about equity as we went through this. And so the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot is how do we care for our faculty, our professors, so they can care for students. So in my role as a faculty developer, I need to show care for them, even when they're making decisions that I don't agree with, to help them through that, because it's been kind of traumatic for a lot of people, to help them care for that. And so examples that my institution did was the credits fail. I don't know what it was like in Europe, but I know in the US, a lot of institutions did the pass fail, credit fail type of thing. My institute was very careful to say to faculty, don't take attendance. We don't know what people's connectivity issues are. We don't know how many people in a house need to use the internet at the same time. We talked a lot about flexibility with students and giving faculty ideas for how to do this. We tried to encourage really hard alternative assessments versus exams. We didn't succeed completely at this one. And still some people prefer to choose to use proctoring. And then our institution gave specially extra technical support for scholarship students in terms of giving them laptops if they didn't have them. Most of them did have them through the institution, but also like giving them extra internet and things like that. So I think moving forward, we're fully online next semester, except for very few labs that need to be in person and very, very few things. And there's a high emphasis on digital literacy. So let's not just focus on this emergency remote, whatever, but like, let's think about this a bit more thoughtfully. And so we're giving fully online institutes for people to think about a little bit more. I'm thinking as a teacher, because the course has an intercultural component, which intersects with Equity Unbound, is that we can have much more intercultural opportunities because a lot more people are online now. And in terms of public scholarship, I'm working on, I've started working on this inclusive academia approach and trying to think about, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been going on for a really long time, but it feels like this is the right moment to push further into anti-racist, anti-colonial academic formats, especially in this time of the pandemic. So we're working on that with Equity Unbound. And yeah, so I'm slightly less overwhelmed, but I'm still this multitasking mom. My daughter helped me choose the, the pictures, and she also helped me do this background for the slides. So this is me. I hope I didn't take too long.
Oh, you had help. Deciding like it. I'm just interrupting for a quick second because I just wanted to point folks to the Q&A section, that if you do have any questions, pop them into the chat or the Q&A as we're talking. And I might hand over to Sukaina.
So I'm just trying to get my screen sharing. I thought it was set up. Just give me a second. Okay, can you hear me and see me properly? I'm just going to... Sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So just want to say thank you, Kate, for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my experiences and share the experience that we've had at the University of Cape Town. Kate, when you invited me, you said that you felt people really hadn't had a chance to reflect on this moment. And so I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity actually to do some reflection as I thought about these slides and what I wanted to say. Just to say that the perspective that I'm going to give is from being part of a leadership team at a Centre for Teaching and Learning. We can discuss that maybe a little bit more as we go through. So just a little bit about University of Cape Town. Maha has visited us. It was a lovely visit a while ago. We are a traditional research-intensive residential university. We have 6 faculties and just under 30,000 students, both at the undergraduate and postgraduate level. And for the university, the residential experience is the norm, with conventional lectures, tutorials, labs, fairly traditional assessments and practicals. We have a well-integrated learning management system based on open source and widely used lecture capture system, but generally the technology infrastructure has been used to support the in-person experience. In terms of my role, a little bit about me. So I work at the Centre for Innovation in Learning and Teaching, CILT. I'm part of the leadership team there. My background is in learning design and project management, particularly around in-house capacity building for online and blended course development, online education strategy and consulting, and research. And I've played various roles over the last few years as our MOOC team project manager, online education project manager. I'm currently the cluster lead for our course and curriculum design team and currently acting deputy director. So over the past 5 years or so, what I have done is to work in a number of projects that have tried to instigate, conceptualize, and really think about experimenting in different forms of blended and online learning. And this has been involved working with faculty, with academics, in supporting them. But generally, we've been working with early adopters, people who are really keen and really not perhaps gone into kind of the mainstream environment. And although our aim in terms of projects such as the MOOCs project and in looking at some postgraduate degrees which are online or more blended online courses, we've built some in-house capacity, and we have a team of people, learning designers, learning technologists, video production staff. We're building studios, more studios. And we've deepened our own research and evaluation capacity for online and blended. But effectively, this has been kind of fairly kind of experimental innovation space. I mean, it's been a wonderful space to be in, but it's certainly very different from where we are now. And I think another thing probably just to point out is another very important contextual factor that informs attitudes to blended and online learning in the South African context is the experience of the Fees Must Fall and the Rose Must Fall movements that manifested in student protests relatively recently. So that was in 2015 and 2016, where this represented a university-wide sector movement for free and decolonized higher education that put the interests of poor Black students to the fore and spoke to the deep structural and systemic inequalities in post-apartheid South Africa. Ultimately, the protests did result in free higher education for students from bands of particular socioeconomic disadvantage, and conversations about decolonization of curricula, of teaching, of pedagogies, whose knowledge counts, what is taught, they have really forever changed the way we think about higher education since that moment. And those conversations are continuing even now, contested, generative, exciting, but they continue. And so that was a real moment. And I'm mentioning this here because at that time, blended and online learning was one of the strategies that universities and academics turned to complete the academic year when campuses had to be shut down due to protests. And this led to very polarized views often about the role of online teaching being seen by some in the movement as undermining the values of the protests. In retrospect, I suppose, reflecting back, it's also provided an uncomfortable rehearsal of sorts for university shutdowns as well. So that's very much part of our context as we even think about online and blended learning. So just quickly, what happened in March this year, we were confronted, as all of you were, with the prospect of campus closures. And at the end of March, students were asked to vacate residences. South African year starts, academic year starts in February. It's our summer. So I always chuckle a bit when I hear about all these plans for fall because we don't have such a thing. And so students at that time barely had one term of teaching and then they were sent home. And like many other institutions, there was an expectation that plans would need to have to be made to continue teaching and learning. When we looked at Global North, at other institutions, we saw sometimes a straight switch to synchronous pedagogies with high bandwidth video being a kind of default and a replication of classroom technologies. For South African universities, the transition has been quite different. A major issue for us is that as soon as students leave residences and they no longer have access to on-campus computer labs, their ability and readiness to learn in online spaces is immediately compromised. And while this was known to us, the scale and level was unknown, and the severity and scope. And across the sector, we had to anticipate these kinds of issues, and that the challenge for South African universities such as ours was to be able to even deliver some form of remote learning in a context of deep inequalities and also of uncertainties. So we couldn't assume that students would have laptops, we didn't know how many. Given the cost of data, we couldn't assume that connectivity would be possible. And added to this are the inequitable studying and living conditions for many students and staff who would now have to navigate these kind of new teaching and learning spaces. Ultimately,
Sukaina, I might just cut across you there for a second, that your slides don't seem to be advancing, and I didn't want to interrupt you mid-sentence.
Is it going now?
No, not for me. That you might need to stop screen sharing and just start again.
Okay, I will do that, thanks. Can you see it now?
Yeah, looks good.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just trying to advance it now. Yeah. So it seems to have slowed down a bit. Okay. Sorry about that. Thanks very much, Kate. So I'm just going to talk through very quickly some of the responses to this particular context that that might resonate. Actually, I think we've certainly picked up as we've been working. So the first response was really to ameliorate the digital divide. So Maha referred to the provision of laptops for certain students. We also were able to do that following a comprehensive student access survey where we were able to identify students and actually find them and offer laptops and then courier it to them. We also managed to negotiate what's called zero rating with cell phone providers so that access to our learning management system and educational websites would be data-free, so would not cost data. And the university also provides internet data bundles per month to all students with a South African cell phone number. So these are the kinds of some of the mitigating responses. Another important aspect was how to guide the staff to design online learning that would be appropriate for students, and that took account of the particular needs and the unsuitability of high bandwidth synchronous video, which was sometimes an immediate response of staff to say, well, this is how we can teach. So we developed a set of technical and pedagogical strategies, which we called low-tech remote teaching, to account for the specific context. These were set forward as a set of principles, guidelines, what to do, what not to do, and communicated through webinars and consultations. And effectively, they're based on pedagogies that privilege asynchronous, low-tech modes of teaching, and that take account not only the data and connectivity issues, but the need for students to flexibly manage their time. That we know that many students would have caring responsibilities, home circumstances that would not allow them to connect together at the same times. So there was very much a principle of equity built into these particular guidelines, and those we've been very happy to see adopted at the university governance levels, but also by other universities in South Africa. Along with this was a revised academic framework, again based on student survey, with students asking them how many hours do you think you would actually be able to study in this environment. There was a reduced weekly workload for students, signaling that this is not business as usual. As Maha said, we were also able to negotiate and agree by and large a pass-fail grading system. This is a huge kind of departure from previous practices. We have continuous assessments, no invigilated exams, no proctored exams, partly because of data and connectivity issues. And we also realized that there would be students who would not be able to participate regardless of all the mitigating strategies or circumstances. And so for those students, provision of paper-based or offline learning materials are couriered and picked up, with assessments being picked up with the next courier, and so on. So those are the kinds of strategies that have been adopted for that. So just looking to the future, and Kate, I mean, you were asking, like, what is the future going to look like? And it's really, really difficult to take a long-term view. We don't know where this pandemic is going. And to me, it looks like there's going to be ongoing teaching and learning challenges that we all together have to look at. And in fact, the future is now, and we're working on it, and we're shaping it. So I'll just finish with talking about a few of the types of activities that we're seeing needing to deepen and extend. So one of the major changes in my role from before to now has been really participation in central decision-making process. So I kind of call it sort of coming in from the fringe to the center of my work. So and my colleagues in CILT. It's really around being able to called on to advise on key moments and key decisions around what emergency remote teaching would look like. For example, we suggested online orientation that was adopted and then sort of rolled out generally across the sector, development of materials and those kinds of courses for faculty, and those kinds of things continue. We're also asked to support in the use of data and learning analytics for supporting students. And really, this has been quite interesting and surprising because that's helped really meet some of the equity issues around being able to identify particular cohorts of students who are either able to engage or not engage in remote teaching, and how to support them as we build more wraparound support services in emergency remote teaching. So that's been some of the work that I think will have to deepen and continue. Because what's really apparent is that despite all of these strategies, emergency remote teaching has really made visible the existing disparity and really the role of residencies for reducing inequalities. When you take those away, we've got really very serious groups of, serious challenges with particular groups of students who are really struggling, both with workload, time management, pressures of continuous assessment, students are reporting feeling disconnected. That's partly just because of the nature of being in the middle of a public health crisis and all the anxiety and mental health challenges, but also because without synchronous sort of fully connected teaching, students do feel disconnected. We've seen a big uptake of WhatsApp, as part of a strategy around that. But really, we are moving to sort of whole person support, and a lot of our strategies, student wellness, disability services, mental health services, and all of those have kind of moved online and become more central to being part of the teaching and learning process. There's been appreciation of care from the teachers. That's come out very strongly from students in recent feedback. And again, it's around keeping connected with students. And Jessie in his keynote yesterday mentioned about going beyond surveying to actually listening and finding out what the experience of students are. And certainly that is something that needs to be deepened more. And lastly, just in terms of supporting academics and teaching teams, and I sort of heard what you said, Jessie, about not rolling out models uncritically. And what we found is that's absolutely true, that we haven't really been able to pick anything off the shelf anywhere, but really develop just-in-time customized guidelines for departments, faculties, and particular themes. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to this. And I think that that also helps in understanding better how to kind of move to just teaching in these spaces rather than sort of focusing on the emergency elements as well. And we'll also be developing more formal courses and continuing professional development for teaching online for academics. This is going to be part of some part of the future, even for residential sort of universities who privilege the in-person interactions. Assessment challenges continue. There are new forms of assessment in these online spaces, the need to balance integrity with student well-being. There's a particular challenge, not just the technical issues about assessment, but also philosophical conversations about the meaning of assessment. What does this all mean? And we've also been using student feedback data to lobby for pedagogical challenges. So we've created a customized checklist for semester 2 courses that were based on student feedback in student administered surveys. And we picked out specific issues that students were having difficulty with around course design, course navigation, course communications, and then developed a checklist for academics on top of that. So that's the kinds of strategies that we think are useful and contextually relevant. So my last slide really is just from a personal impact. I mentioned the story has kind of been from kind of fringe to mainstream for people who have been working in online and blended learning. And first of all, I'm incredibly grateful professionally and personally for the colleagues that I have and the ability to kind of jump and just respond to these challenges, but also grateful for the community kind of generally on Twitter and around the world, and this sort of, we're kind of doing things differently, but also together. I'm also very aware of the importance of university structures that have invested in the capacity for supporting teaching and learning, and really some important conversations for institutions about outsourcing versus in-house capacity building, I think, have come to the fore here. Because I think to have some level of readiness, there's got to be some level of commitment to developing further in-house capacity. I'm personally exhausted and exhilarated at the same time. The sort of amount of momentum and pace is just mind-boggling, really. But just to be mindful of the long-term impacts of these kinds of trauma that people are going through, my colleagues, myself, all of us together, our students, our teachers, academics, but also in this sort of opportunities for innovation. And then also I'm troubled and awed at the same time with the huge systemic challenges that the system has. Many higher education sectors and contexts globally, but particularly in South Africa, but also, I suppose, awed at the potential that there is for change when something as big as this comes along. So I will stop there and just say thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As I'm trying to listen and man the Q&A and look at all of the questions that had come in even previously, I'm wondering how we are going to get to everything. But I want to thank Laura in the background for sharing some of those resources, and thank you for tying in the reflection aspect, as well as, you know, looking at that very practical and exhausting work that some of us in those teaching and learning centers have been doing throughout this period. I'm conscious of time, that I might just pass over to Jesse to share some of his experiences before we go to questions, if that's okay, Jesse?
Yep, that's perfect. Well, one of the things that I just want to point out how valuable I think it is the way that Maha started her section, asking people how they are feeling. And one thing I really loved about what she did is that she acknowledged their feelings as well, because as we think about how we listen to students and how we listen to our colleagues, I think that it's really important that we find ways to make our listening visible. And so that means letting people know that we're there, letting people know that we hear them, because there's sort of a double importance of the listening. The listening both is practical, because it's about making immediate change based on what we hear students need and based on what we hear our colleagues need. But it also is a way of creating a space of psychological safety, a space of allowing our traumas to be made visible when and where we can, and a space to bring our full selves to a situation. And we feel like we can do that when other people can see us and hear us. And so it's super valuable. Thank you for that. There was something that Sukaina said, which was, she talked about making apparent existing disparities. And this has kind of been the theme of the last 3 months for me, has been thinking about the ways that this situation is helping me realize blind spots that I didn't know that I had, helping me realize the severity of situations that I was already writing about, things that I was already writing about, already thinking about, but realizing just how much they were affecting students, even to a greater degree than I had before. I'm going to pull up some slides where I talk a little bit about where my work was just before the pandemic hit, the things that I was thinking about, the things that were affecting the work that I have been doing. So I started doing this work with Sarah Goldrick-Rab, where we were beginning to think about how her work on food and housing insecurity, particularly in a US context, but I've found as I've traveled and talked to people in other environments that this issue of food and housing insecurity is definitely something that resonates across, across those boundaries. And what I had begun to think about is the ways that her work, which is pointed more at policy, it's pointed more at making structural change in the higher education system in the United States. I had been thinking about, how does the work that she's doing change what we do in classrooms? How does it change the way we design courses? How does it change the way we design programs? And ultimately now what I've experienced in the last 3 months is, how does the work that she's done change the way we respond to a pandemic like this one? So this is a quote from a piece that Sarah and I wrote called "Teaching the Students We Have, Not the Students We Wish We Had." We write, "Today's college students are the most overburdened and undersupported in American history. More than 1 in 4 have a child, almost 3 in 4 are employed, and more than half receive Pell Grants but are left far short of the funds required to pay for college." And according to the Hope Center's National Real College Survey, out of 86,000 students surveyed, and this data is a little bit dated. She's continuing to do this work, continuing to find more data to support this. But out of 86,000 students surveyed, 56% were housing insecure in the previous year, and 17% were homeless. So when we know this, how does it change how we interact with students? Sarah tells a great anecdote about a student sleeping in her class, and about how when she talked to that student and found out the reason that they were sleeping, it absolutely changed the way that she interacted with something like a student sleeping in class, or the way that she thought about attention in class. And so that's been something I've been thinking a lot about. How do we talk about attention that way? And how do we talk about where difficulty being attentive, where it comes from for a lot of our students? LGBTQ young adults had a 120% higher risk of reporting homelessness compared to youth who identified as heterosexual and cisgender. So when we're thinking about policies at educational institutions where dorms close during the Christmas holiday or the winter holiday, and when we think specifically about what happens to the students who are sent home, what happens to the students who are sent home when they have no home to go to, and who specifically is most affected by that? This is some data from a piece called All Teachers Should Be Trained to Overcome Their Hidden Biases. And it's a really short piece that was in Time magazine. And if you go to the piece, you can click on all the links to see the full studies for some of the data here. Black girls are 12 times more likely than their white counterparts to be suspended. While Black children make up less than 20% of preschoolers, they make up more than half of out-of-school suspensions. Preschoolers. My daughter is not yet in preschool. She's going to be starting preschool. My daughter is Black, and I see data like this, and it really hits home and helps me understand. I mean, we're talking about suspensions in preschool. Teachers spend up to 2/3 of their time talking to male students. They also are more likely to interrupt girls. When teachers ask questions, they direct their gaze towards boys more often, especially when questions are open-ended. I'm going to stop my sharing and just continue to talk about this a little bit. And so when I think about that data, and I think about the work that I was previously doing, and then I think about this moment, and I think about how, as Sukaina talked about, this moment is, just to use her words again, is making apparent existing disparities. When I think about things like trauma, and I think about things like inequities, and I think about things like exclusion, I have to think about the way that the students who are experiencing that right now were already most likely to have experienced that before. And a lot of the changes, a lot of the structural and systemic changes that I see institutions making are affecting and helping the students who were least in need of the systemic changes. For example, the way that the grade situation at my own institution, the grade changes were made. There was a reliance on accommodations or giving students the ability to opt into or opt out of things, or the ability for students to make appeals. And one of the things that I thought about was the way in which the students who needed that help the most were the least likely to ask for help, and were the least likely to go through an appeal process. And they were also the least likely to trust those appeal processes, because the system had already been set up previously for those processes to be a blockade for them. So it's something, when we talk about, I'm really grateful for the chat about saying things like planning for fall. It is something that I have caught myself saying. I'm now going to say planning for next semester. When in March, I remember thinking and hearing people talking about planning for April, and then planning for graduation in May, if it was going to happen or not happen. And I remember in March, I started saying, we need to plan for fall. We need to plan for next semester. Right now, I hear so many people talking about planning for next semester, and I want us to talk about planning for the semester after that, and the semester after that. How do we address some of these issues, some of these inequities, so that if this continues to happen around the world in our local environments, we're prepared for it? And if it happens again, which it will, and it won't be this, it'll be something else that we can't plan for. I loved also the thing that Sukaina said about not pulling anything off the shelf. This isn't about setting up shelves of response plans. It is instead about opening lines of communication, so that as this continues, as we continue to face this situation, as we face new challenges, we have ways to talk about them. So thank you. I'm really excited for the conversation that will ensue.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for sharing. And as I'm busily trying to keep an eye on things here in the background, as the host, I think there's one emerging thing maybe before we come to the questions, and really that has come up in the chat, and it's coming up in the Q&A, and even in the before questions, is just around care. Is that, how are we going to continue that level of care if we're teaching like you're talking about? What are we planning for? So if we're planning for the future, if we're planning for, fall or next semester, or whatever we're calling it, that thread seems to weave throughout. So one thing I might toss back to the panelists is, really, how are we going to foster that, either in our policies, because we've had some questions on that, in our assessment methods, in our online courses, or even in our supports for students? Are there any kind of overriding thoughts on that? Feel free to come in, any of you.
Did you want to start, because I might have to.
Sorry, I was actually
replying to the Q&A.
I know I
was looking at the chat, so I don't know what the question was. Yeah.
Yeah, can you repeat the question? I was replying to the Q&A.
There's so much great going on in the chat that I was like, ah.
How do you think I feel? I was trying to watch all of it too. Yes. No, I would just say this, the simple question, because we have so much going on. I was trying to simplify some of the thoughts that are kind of pouring into one more succinct question. Was I see an awful lot coming in about support for students, about care for students, about building communities, that given that we're planning for something that's a bit uncertain, but that we know will generally be happening online, is there anything we can do in either our assessment practices or policies?
I'm going to say something really quick because Tanya Elias was talking about also the fact that trauma has been happening to students all the time, and not just now. It's happening to everyone at various levels, but beforehand it already existed. And I think, you know, going back to this thing about students who don't know to apply for financial aid, who don't know or who don't have access, I think when we plan ahead of time for these things to be in the structure, not something additional that some students need to ask for, but plan for flexibility and for different pathways as much as possible to begin with. And then the student who doesn't have access will have another pathway. They don't have to actually apply for the pathway. They don't have to beg for that pathway. They're already in trouble and you're asking them to do more effort. So if you plan ahead for that, that for me is one of the key things. For showing care, it's just giving options from the beginning and structuring that in. And for me, as a faculty developer, it's helping faculty imagine that so that that's the way it's planned, but having the institutions support them to do that as well. Because obviously they need support to be able to imagine, because they never had to do all of that. So for me, that's just one, just basic principle. It's not a it's a principle that you go in saying there might be students who have different needs and different problems, and I'll try to have this pre-planned to give them those options.
Yeah, I'll say something briefly. I quoted in my keynote from the trauma-informed approach to teaching during the coronavirus from the Teaching Tolerance website. And the first bit that I drew from that was to establish a routine and maintain clear communication. And I think that what I feel like is important for us to do at this moment is to make decisions, even if we don't know that those decisions will be right. I see a lot of institutions, certainly tons of institutions in the United States that are waffling right now, trying to figure out what's going to happen. And I feel like what students and what my colleagues need is they need to not be constantly sitting in a place of uncertainty. Our world is giving us so much uncertainty that we don't need that level of uncertainty at our institutions. There will be necessarily a certain level of uncertainty, but I think saying it will be one of these 6 things is very difficult for us to hear if we're in a place of trauma, if we're in a place of dealing with juggling our own responses to the current situation. And so what I wish I saw institutions doing is making decisions quick and early, and being willing to change their mind if they need to, and being willing to make mistakes and be wrong. I think a lot of institutions are so afraid of doing the wrong thing that they are currently either not doing anything or doing 6 things at once, expecting everyone to prepare for all of the possible contingencies. Maybe we need contingencies, but we don't necessarily need 4 or 5 or 6. Can you make a decision as an institution and have there be 2 contingencies that we're preparing for? And then a recognition, as Maha said, that we won't necessarily know what's going to happen until it happens, and that we have to be prepared to be flexible with whatever decisions we do make.
I'll come in I agree with the flexibility and the decision making. I think another strand that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't is communications, and to get the right communication to the right people at the right time. And that's been really challenging, especially, students need to know what's happening, and, if there is a date at which, they can drop courses without financial penalty, which is an accommodation. It doesn't help if they don't know it, for example. So the role, I've just been seeing how the need for a kind of thought through way of how people are going to be communicated to without making assumptions, and also to break some of the kind of traditional barriers in a university around, you know, who gets to know what and when. And so I think that's also something that has come out as a need. If you have built-in flexibility and care, and as somebody said in the chat, a kind of universal design approach to care and flexibility. Thanks.
Thank you, folks, for trying to make sense of a question that was trying to put together about 10 other questions that have come in. We have so many questions, and I fully agree that, you know, we have these great conversations going on in the chat as well, that it's hard to figure out what to really address next. But I want to just quickly thank people that when they signed up did submit a question that was, you know, particularly a burning question for them. So I just wanted to address one of those right now, just pulling it up so I get it correct, is we had a participant ask, how do we ensure effectively or an equivalent process with online learning to the socialization and culture creation that happens on campus? So that's something particularly that's come up. I think the project team here will know, especially in the Irish context, is that if we're limited in the face-to-face capabilities, which it looks like we will be, what can we do to foster socialization and culture creation in the online space? I know that some of you folks do that quite well, both in the classroom and in your other work, not looking at Maha in particular with using the online as a social space. But how, do you have any thoughts in particular on culture creation and socialization for our students?
Yeah, I have a short thing to say, which is that I've written a little bit about the fact that on college campuses, we have things like LGBTQ resource centers. We have things like multicultural centers. We have disability resource offices. We have quads, we have dorms, we have spaces where students eat, spaces where students gather, we have benches. I have a great picture of me and Maha sitting on her campus working at a wood table, and that space is a liminal space. It's a space between spaces, and the kind of stuff that happens in those spaces between spaces is some of the most important work that we do in education. And ultimately, where are we creating those kinds of spaces when we either move our work online or when we create online programs? And I think that where are we doing it? The fact is that we're not doing it mostly. And if we are doing it, we're not doing it nearly enough. So I think making sure that we create the spaces so that students can inhabit those spaces and we can inhabit them with them is the first and I would say most important thing to do there. I will, and I don't mean to push back on the question asker, this is an absolutely marvelous question, but I want to point to the word equivalence and say that I don't think it will be equivalent, and I don't think we want it to be equivalent. It will be something different. And I think when we try for equivalence, we will fail, and then it won't work. And then we will say, hey, look, it doesn't work. But if we just acknowledge from the beginning that it's not possible to create equivalence, then I think what we can create is something good, something that's valuable.
And actually something that might have affordances that the face-to-face doesn't have. Yes, we're going to be missing that tactile sense, but yeah, people were talking about this in the chat, Slack, WhatsApp, those kinds of spaces. One of the things that happens in my institutions is that some departments created WhatsApp for the faculty together, and then they weren't allowed to put GIFs and jokes in them. I'm like, then create an email list. If you want it to be formal, create an email list, but if you're gonna have semi-synchronous, the semi-synchronicity is really cool because it's like sitting in a cafeteria and someone can jump in at any time, someone can leave, someone can overhear. And those kinds of spaces. And so if you're a teacher, and I don't know, actually, we never asked people here if they're teachers or if they're educational developers or what their roles are. But if you're a teacher, how do you create those spaces in your classes? If you can't go outside your learning management system for policy reasons, you can just create a discussion forum called a cafe and let people do whatever they want there and don't go there even yourself necessarily, unless the students call you in. Or you create those spaces yourself outside of the LMS like Slack or whatever. I think one of the affordances is that you can create, rather than limit to the walls of the classroom, because there are no walls anymore, if you're going to be online, is that those can cross with other classes, either that you teach or in another institution that are learning the same things. Obviously, you don't want them to be huge spaces. The other thing I think is creating small private spaces, and things like Zoom breakout rooms or smaller spaces for discussion within your class, or just buddy systems of small groups of students working together to support each other, rather than always needing us as their teachers or whatever. I think those kinds of things help. So sort of the semi-synchronicity, but also the small private ones, not always public in front of the whole class type of engagement and participation.
Also, if I can add, I was just thinking about this question earlier and thinking that I mean, I completely agree with the issue of equivalence and trying to get back to where you were, because that time doesn't really exist, and it's almost bringing what's happening in the wider society into the spaces, either into the teaching space, but also into the opportunity for people to tell their stories. So at UCT, there's an initiative called Lockdown Diaries, where people can send in anything that they like, any artifact, picture, story. Our department made a video of our life under lockdown, and that's shared more generally. So that's another way of curating artifacts experience, almost like diarizing what's happening as a record, because this is going to be a kind of historical moment and for people to have their input. So again, that's a kind of crossover between a kind of social space and something a little bit more formal, but it's not to ignore the pandemic, but to acknowledge it in this space and in the spaces that might be created.
Thank you, folks. And I won't make a big deal, Jessie. I know you have to do your Digital Pedagogy Lab duties, so we'll just say thank you as you have to bow out. Thanks a million for your time. And we do understand if anyone is conflicted between different Digital Pedagogy Lab events. I have one kind of more positive question coming in. That's a bit more open-ended. That do you think, or actually I should read the question as it is, sorry, is what positive outcomes for the longer term do you think hold the most promise?
I can have a go. So I think that we've been thinking about this and the opportunity to make big shifts, because this is a big shift at scale. So for a very long time, the invigilated exam, for example, has been, the gold standard of something. I'm not quite sure what. So those kinds of shifts that people have actually tried it out in the mainstream, and not early adopters and people who are keen, but people have had to just do it because of the circumstance. You can't do invigilated exams, you can't do proctored exams, there's equity issues. So people have had to experiment with more innovative, perhaps more equitable types of assessment. And assessment is just so core to the kind of people's experience of how they feel and how they're judged and how they're evaluated. So I think for me, one of the possible kind of positive outcomes of all this will be a more nuanced and some interesting discussions about where assessment might go, and especially in our context where it has been quite rigid. So that's one area that I feel quite excited about and positive and hopeful about.
Yeah, I also feel like, just interrogating what academic integrity means and what is a good assessment. These are things that we've been wanting people to think about for quite some time, but a lot of people, we did have better connectivity for most students, and I always told them, if you have 1 or 2 students who are having connectivity problems, you shouldn't be doing this, because what about these 2 students? Like, you're just putting them aside. So a lot of people did try to go with the alternative route, and so they're thinking about that a lot more. So maybe more people are doing it. It's not a complete shift over here, but more people are thinking about that. I'm hoping also that the focus on care and equity stays, because as people were saying, people go through trauma all the time, and a lot of it's invisible and we don't know what they're going through. It's just that now everyone's going through something, a level of something that you take care of it, but it's something that I think we should care about all the time and be cognizant of. And maybe one of the things that I don't think is probably going to happen out of this, which I think some people expected, is that they thought, oh, well, now everybody's tried online learning, so online learning now has a free pass. And I don't think it's like that, because everyone has tried very bad options for online learning. So a lot of people have seen some really, really bad online learning, and some people are going to be turned off from it. Hopefully next semester, where whatever that is for whoever it is, hopefully will be better, because people learned a little bit, but nobody has gotten the kind of support that online courses used to take of 6 months of working with an instructional designer and instructional support and all that stuff. And maybe we rethink what we should be doing with even the planned ones. That maybe they can be done a little bit with less quality on the video, for example, and more focus on what I always thought the problem was, that we help faculty design online courses, but we don't help them facilitate online courses. And facilitation is the more important.
No, and thank you on all counts, because I'm just keeping an eye on the chat as well while you're talking. And yeah, I note that Nora has said, you know, that there's a lot of positive feedback here in Ireland around alternative assessments. And yeah, absolutely, that we were functioning in those same ways with traditional structures and trying to, yeah, talk to our staff about considering other options, and certainly the technical aspects of trying to make those things work. You know, certainly it's time consuming. I just think in relation to students, there's actually a very straightforward question here in terms of what challenges do you think would be, what challenges will students face in the new normal? That what do we think they'll face in terms of teaching online or only being partially on campus?
So, I mean, our student service are all telling us about the importance of connections and connecting with their peers and connecting with their teachers and their kind of courses. And so I think that continues to be a challenge, particularly in our context because of connectivity. But I think I mentioned, we've really seen some innovative use of WhatsApp and kind of low data, semi-synchronous types of technology, which I think are crucially important now for keeping that connection going. And that is a challenge, because the longer this goes on, when people thought it was one term, you can push through almost, and there was hope that, you know, certainly from student social media and student feedback, they were hoping they'd be back for, you know, the second semester or later in the year, and now that's becoming increasingly likely. So it's the longer the pandemic goes, the longer the public health situation worsens and the kind of levels of anxiety. So I think those are particular challenges going forward. And so our strategies towards the kind of wraparound care that includes you know, help for students' time management and managing mental health, and putting a lot of our services are already online. It's been interesting, the take-up. It's been high, really, really high. So I think that those will continue. And then the impact of decisions that students make, like it's fine if you dropped a course, then what happens? Does that affect graduation? Does that affect fees? So there's going to be long-term impacts kind of built into the system that will then start filtering through as well. So we'll probably get a sort of second wave of kind of more trauma and then issues around what people can do. So I think there's the longevity of what's happening as well. And I know that there's different years. So for many people, you know, the fall is the start of a new academic year. For us, our academic year probably, which started in February this year, will only end in March next year now because of the extension and gaps and needing to extend the terms. So that those kinds of structural issues will have impacts as well that then need to be designed for in terms of keeping students on track.
I would have said exactly the same thing. This continuing trauma and helping students with things like time management and the cognitive load, also like their concentration, and the teachers too, honestly, because we're going through trauma. We have children, like those of us who have children in school, and everything is, and people who have elderly parents, and this is not even accounting for whether we or our students get sick or someone close to them gets sick or dies. Like this is not it's not just, I think one of the problems is that universities talk about as if it's a problem of online learning, but it's actually a health problem, right? And so,
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, even in our own context, that we are looking at the idea of the academic year and when does it start. That, you know, in our local context, it would be towards the end of September, but looking at when the leaving certificate result for those students coming into first year might be released now. I won't go into the full context. I know a lot of the Irish folks are still here and they're well familiar with this. So there is that, absolutely, that balance around, you know, what they're going through and the uncertainty of what they're going through, and also how do we move that academic year. Obviously those decisions are made by more important folks than me, but it is, I can certainly put myself as a former secondary school teacher in the shoes of those students, knowing what they go through anyway in that transition period, but certainly trying to adapt both at the institutional level, but just in our level of care for them it's truly staggering. I saw one other little comment in the chat there about the prioritization of research over teaching, and that continual debate. I know the Irish institutions, you know, present here will have certainly heard that debate time and time again. Just given that you're in a similar context, Sukaina, that do you think that debate is maybe truly over, or is that still continuing because we're finally seeing that little prioritization around teaching and learning?
So we, you know, our feedback from academics is that they're just completely exhausted. And this has just taken a huge toll and a huge impact on all their other kind of responsibilities, research, social responsiveness, you know, all the other areas. And where that goes, it's just, again, it's just uncertain, because on the other hand, they're incredibly committed to their students at the same time. And so I think this is just one of those impossible situations for people. And that people might well end up having to take certain decisions along the way. You know, that we're all hoping for kind of like a calming down of something somewhere along the way. But as I was saying, it just seems relentless, actually. You know,
but I also want to acknowledge the gendered nature of all this.
Yes.
So when we talk about, but in most countries and in most situations, women are taking the toll of this much harder because they're responsible for home care and child care and all of that. I'm sure not all families are like that, and not all countries and not every situation, but that's also another thing to keep in mind. So it's not equally distributed. It's not an equally distributed struggle. And so some of us will be struggling through this much harder than others. It's important to acknowledge that and find ways, and I don't know how. I know the Femme EdTech, which Sukaina, you're part of that, are focusing on this as well. It's like we're recognizing that women are going to have more trouble getting their papers published and reducing the load on them. I'm peer reviewing almost 2 papers a week right now, and I'm thinking I'm doing it for other people, but it's a lot of load on me, and thinking about all of the impacts of all that.
There's also a knock taken to research funding, which many universities are highly dependent on, and that's already having impacts, partly because of austerity, but also funders rethinking what to do. So all of these kinds of knock-on effects in the system. But you're absolutely right, Maha, this sort of gendered approach. And certainly, I mean, there's little bits of research coming out as well, but I can't see it getting better, immediately.
Well, I mean, someone has to make certain decisions at the top to either lower the requirements, for example, for tenure for women, or there's some sort of something to acknowledge these inequalities. Not just, of course, gender is the obvious one because it applies to me, but obviously in other contexts it will be other issues, but just acknowledging those. I did want to say something that occurred to me earlier in response to something about supporting students and understanding, this all of us who've been in online learning for a long time know that asynchronous is the dominant mode of online learning. And obviously in this pandemic, a lot of people went for the synchronous, thinking that it would replace what they would have done in the class, but also it's just less cognitive load to prepare for, right? And what I think I've learned in this pandemic, I mean, I've been in online learning for 18 years, that sometimes is what we need, and not everyone will be able to reach it. If you can do it, and the students seem to need it as well, like our students were very upset with faculty who didn't do any synchronous sessions, is that if you can do it well and do it properly and not get people all together in the same space to lecture at them, and if you can find ways to help others who can't make it, replace the time either by watching a recording or doing some other activity, if it's what people need in this time, because it gives a less cognitive load, it allows a little bit more socio-emotional interaction. If you can do it, then this is one thing I've learned not to resist anymore. Like at the very beginning of the pandemic, I said, give people the Zoom option. I didn't realize they would need it this much. And we've stopped telling them don't do it. We've just told them think about those who can't make it and figure out who can do it. Sukaina, you want to say something now?
Yeah, I mean, it's been it's probably a little bit more difficult in our context, but we have, I mean, our guidelines are, and we've re-released them actually because there's lots of people who do want to do synchronous. Students are asking for synchronous as well amongst the student body, but we've just, said you need to think about it very carefully, apply the principle of equitable teaching, avoid it for kind of content delivery. If you're going to use it for interaction, then give alternatives to other groups of students for similar interaction, and design it in a way that minimizes exclusion. Because I think you're right, Maha, though some of those moments of synchronicity can make the difference for groups of students. But it is still pretty tricky in our context.
Especially if it's the same students who are always excluded.
Yeah, sort of it's not a blanket ban, but it's about thinking it through. And certainly we've got some of our assessments, performing arts, creative arts, which are using synchronous for, music and oral exams and things like that. And for those, students are prepared, their data kind of is accounted for somehow, those kinds of strategies. So it's in the design because it does have a role, and definitely that kind of, as we're doing now, that kind of moment-to-moment interaction.
I kind of got sick of giving people Zoom sessions about how to do asynchronous learning. And kept telling them we need to give them an asynchronous experience about asynchronous learning so that they experience it and then they'll be convinced. We don't bring them together here and talk to them about asynchronous learning.
So Maha, we started with that. We did a whole series of webinars about how to teach asynchronously, and then in the end decided that was not the right thing entirely. So we actually created an asynchronous course on how to develop an asynchronous course. And we've 3 cohorts through that now. And in that, it's really revealing how people are saying, I know what my students feel now, because they're in the space. And that's again, being in the practice and being in the reflective mode, and choosing the kind of appropriate strategy. So I hear you there.
That's really interesting, because when we change up that practice based on either what feedback we're getting or what needs we see staff having, I know even in our local context that trying to offer some sort of assurance around our learning design workshops, I find myself, and it all gets a bit meta, but trying to assure staff, because it's a synchronous session and I'm trying to recreate something that would be very hands-on and face-to-face and low-tech. So I actually explained throughout the session how I'm adapting to that online space and where things maybe work a bit better and where things maybe don't work as well. But certainly that flexibility has been really important too. But it's absolutely a fair point. I can see in the chat, that folks are starting to even talk about, what kind of requests for people like learning technologists or, people that work in teaching and learning centers or the EDTL team, that what kind of requests we're getting. And it is around those synchronous spaces, but how do we make them more meaningful, or where are they more appropriate, as you're saying, subject-wise, in terms of, what actually does have to work in the synchronous space. And there's still so much coming in, of course.
Yeah, there's some great things
which
in the
is
chat
fantastic.
about experiences, yeah.
Which is fantastic. It's putting the host on her toes, but that's fine. There was actually one other question that came in ahead of time that may or may not be applicable in your local context, but it's certainly something that's come up here. So any thoughts or reflections, just I'm conscious of the time as well, on it would certainly be appreciated. But something that's come up time and time again now for us and members of the EDTL team is large group teaching. For those of us that are trying to support staff or staff that are looking to go out and support a couple of hundred students, is there anything you would offer for advice or tips, or even just a bystander's reflection for teaching large groups of students? And large groups, I suppose, in our context is over 100, maybe 200, 250, that kind of scope.
Yeah, we have some very large classes. We have first year commerce class of over 1,000 students, so that's huge. Computer science 1,100. So I mean, in the the residential space, those were lectures and tuts and the usual kind of group work and things. One of the courses actually before this pandemic hit did actually go online over a few years, partly because of the numbers, and it really adopted a kind of flipped classroom model, where the sort of short videos and lectures were put online with asynchronous, effectively a flipped classroom asynchronous mode. But it really then depends how many tutors you have and whether you've got the tutors to work with small groups. That's where the difference is, I think. And therefore, when people come to us about large classes, it's, as Maha said, you can set up the course design quite well, reasonably well, but it's all in the facilitation and sections and groups. And some of our constraints around actually having tutor numbers to be able to give that sort of smaller group feel. Because I don't think there's really any substitute for that in a very large sense. I mean, you can do, I mean, I'm talking about the asynchronous mode with discussion forums, but you can, I suppose, use Zoom and breakout rooms and try and make the intimate from a very large group, whether it's you're with the same group all the time or you come into groups on a kind of ad hoc basis. I think these are probably strategies that people are trying or have tried. And it just requires sort of actually training for those tutors to be able to facilitate in these online spaces, because that's a whole nother area of kind of professional development, I think, and it often gets relegated to just, tutoring or just being in the space, but there's actually some very mindful strategies that can be used.
What I think is problematic.
Classes, yeah. Maha?
We don't have these huge classes over here, but so those strategies and one other engagement strategy for live sessions would be some sort of, if people can't break out into smaller groups, is some fishbowl type of thing where a percentage of the students, 10 or 15 of them, are interacting today, and then another day it's another group, and people can come in and out, but those would be the key ones, and then others are watching that sometimes. But what I think is most difficult is the assessment part. That's the one I find. I don't know how people deal with them without human bodies to actually give feedback on the work. And obviously you can do things like peer review, but it depends on the level of the students, of whether this is, and their level of autonomy, how well that could work out, and what kind of things you're asking them to do. Is it a lot of written work? Is it problem solving work? So it's trying to find this balance between having maybe the students support each other and then modeling, and then as much as possible, definitely putting them into smaller groups, whether in discussion forums or live breakout sessions. And this fishbowling thing helps a little bit if you can't do that.
Yeah, then a sort of more pragmatic is if, in terms of at least giving people some feedback, is to have sort of mindful quizzes and MCQs in the learning environment. And you have good MCQs and bad MCQs. So it's, again, in how you do it and what you ask, but at least that does give students in very large classes feedback of sorts as well. But yeah, this is really the really tricky one. large classes.
Folks have written classroom assessment techniques and think pair share, and those are also really great to try out this kind of thing. I mean, they're also formative assessments, kind of like the quizzes, in case quizzes don't work in your context. But it really makes a difference. Like, what is it you're teaching? Like, it's very hard to answer these questions out of context, right? I don't know if universities are able to, in this context, employ students who had just taken this course a year ago to help out a little bit at a low wage or something like that. That would be a good way.
Yeah, we have senior tutors who do that. Yeah.
No, yeah, thank you, folks. Yeah, and you know, there are, I suppose, yeah, it is a loaded question because it depends on what you're teaching, or definitely the comments that are coming in that I'm trying to keep an eye on there are definitely around, you know, do you have the people? It's always a hard question even to answer, even in a local context when we're offering training or support, because, you know, it's so hard to gauge how many people are actually physically there. But yeah, that making use of those tools, whether, you know, it's a good MCQ or whether we're doing some peer feedback. We have a program like that on campus as well, with, you know, student peer support. But certainly I think it's going to be availing of the most logical options. Certainly. That there was one final question, because I am conscious of the time that came in, and now I've probably lost it.
Was it in the Q&A?
Yeah, there was one that actually it just seemed, because it's actually been coming up in different iterations in the chat, was just around what we think September or the new term or the next term, will it still be emergency remote teaching? That what do we see it looking like? Will it be more of the same? Will it be more informed, you know, based on this work that you folks are doing and we're all doing? That, do we think it will be more of that continuation, or do we potentially think that something else will emerge?
Can it be something in between? I think definitely people now have some experience. Our professors in the summer, obviously it's not summer in South Africa, but our summer, we created an asynchronous course for them, but without interactivity, which I was very upset about, but never mind. And we gave them a synchronous preparation course, and we helped them with their syllabi a little bit more. And they are reporting better experiences. The students are reporting better experiences. But in our case, the summer is not a required semester, and students would be taking like 1 or 2 courses. So it's not like a regular thing, but they had a good experience now, both the faculty and the students a little bit. And going into the next semester, I think everyone will be motivated to try to do better, because nobody wants to teach badly and nobody wants to struggle. But it's just that for some people, this flexibility and imagination comes more easily than others. And again, the impact is inequitable in terms of trauma, and in terms of access, and in terms of just what your life is like having to work this way. So I think for most people it'll be something hopefully better, but I think there will still be people who struggle even worse.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I think that, you know, we have put in place better support, better structures, you know, more, you know, templates, guidelines, you know, things to make people's lives easier, because I think it's just the workload burden, you know. But I think it's iterative rather than a kind of huge shift. We're not, you know, as Maha said, it usually takes 6 months to make a decent online course, and we haven't had that at all. So it's really iterating towards better kind of quality learning experiences for students, but also sort of hopefully a more, a less sort of emergency and sort of panicked mode for teachers, actually, and who are finding perhaps some purchase in the online mode as well, and in some cases perhaps enjoying kind of connecting with students in different ways. And we've had some people say, oh, I know my students in a different way now because of the sort of asynchronous mode. So we can hold on to some of those as well, some of those kinds of flowerings of positivity in what is, you know, really quite a sort of catastrophic situation, from where we would want to be and where we would even imagined or envisaged that we would be.
I think that's probably more eloquent than what I had intended to end the session on. That in terms of looking at the positives that are emerging from what is obviously a chaotic situation. And I know folks are running ahead to other meetings as everyone is triple booked these days. No, I absolutely agree, and actually it goes back to one of the points. And one of the things that I had pitched to everyone that I invited to this session was to just offer us time for reflection. And part of the reason for that was I'm sure I'm not alone, but I haven't taken any time off since any of this started. I haven't had any space. And just to give us, instead of maybe the more standard type of webinar we were used to, and being that bit more passive, was just to have a conversation in the spirit of Digital Pedagogy Lab of what we would be doing in person, or even if we weren't there in person, over a virtually connecting session, just having that time and even having that weekend built, for those of us that are participating, that I've noticed our out of office messages are up. Mine's only open or up internally for internal staff, but just allowing us that space to have the conversation. So I was going to share my screen very quickly just for one last thought before we move on. 2 seconds. And it was just on one final thought. I know I haven't opened the PowerPoint correctly here. As I keep going back to the Digital Pedagogy Lab ethos and how we're trying to tap into that in the virtual space, just to tie together some of those ideas. And I would say, please do continue, because there are questions we haven't gotten to address yet. There's questions that I've saved that we can point at some of the panelists that were a bit more specific. But just to tie it together with the Digital Pedagogy Lab ethos, again with a quote, to think about community and our capacity to hear each other, just from Bell Hooks. As a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, and hearing one another's voices, and in recognizing one another's presence. And I think for today, I certainly want to give us the opportunity to generate some excitement or some ideas and some interest in having that space to talk to one another and to listen to one another, and to have that sense of presence in the webinar. And also take away that, because I know in the past couple of years at Digital Pedagogy Lab, it's almost more being in that space that wants me to come back and be a better practitioner, because I've had space and time to think and reflect and listen and think about learning in a different way, that it's almost centered me to get started and be refreshed for the coming academic year, whenever year starts. So just something that's applicable to both, I think, maybe where we are at this point of the summer in terms of uncertainty, in terms of maybe taking finally some time off, or getting some rest for those of us, at least in Ireland anyway, but also to take that into our classrooms, that when we move into that online space, obviously contexts are hugely different, but how do we hear our students? How do we recognize our students and their voices, and how do we be present? I think is one of the things that I would truly take away if we were attending DPL in the physical space, but it's certainly proving interesting in the online space as well. So even if you're not registered, I would just encourage you to keep up with the Twitter chat and keep up with what's emerging on the blogs, and in terms of recordings and what's being shared. Do join in. So I will stop sharing that. And I know there are some folks left. If there are any final thoughts from the panelists, I just want to say thank you. Thank you very much for your time. But if there's anything you want to sign off with, feel free. I won't have the last word.
Just thank you. I'm grateful for this opportunity and grateful for all the work that everybody and colleagues are doing. Thank you,
Kate, for bringing us together, and thanks to everyone for the awesome chat. I really enjoyed it. I'll see you, some of you on Twitter and some of you on digital.
Good luck with everything. Thanks.
Thank you all.